Welcome to Humble Beginnings, a podcast where we uncover the unconventional, more relatable paths to success. In this show, we'll share the stories before the C-suites, board memberships, and appointments, the stories of various upbringings, first jobs, career pivots, educational uncertainties, and more. This is the place to hear about their lives from the GovCon executives themselves. We hope you enjoy. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Humble Beginnings. I'm your host, Amanda Ziede, and our guest today is Ann Bjornson, Chief Human Resources Officer at V2X. Thank you so much for joining me today, Ann.
Thanks, Amanda. Great to be here.
Of course. All right. So, Ann, we always like to start with everyone's background, and I understand that you are a native to the greater DC area. But before we kind of get into, where you're from and how you grew up, tell us a bit about your parents. I know there's an interesting story there about kind of who they are and how they met.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks. Again, really glad to be here. You're right. I am a native to the DC metropolitan area, which is, I feel, a rarity these days. But my parents were not. My father grew up in rural Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. He's actually the seventh generation of Virginian. And my mother, on the other hand, was an immigrant from the Philippines. And this is where they met. So my father, by background, he grew up in rural Shenandoah Valley, graduated from high school, and immediately joined the military. He joined the Navy, and this was at the time of the Vietnam War. And so, like many in the military at that time, he went immediately over to Vietnam during that era. So he served his tour in Vietnam and returned back. And the great thing about the military was that it gave him some foundational educational background in a trade. And he came back to the DC area. And he actually joined the Coast Guard, but again, was along the lines of the technical skill he had learned in the military. And this is where he met my mother. My mother had immigrated from the Philippines in the early 70s, was a widow and a young mother. I actually have a half brother who lost his father when he was only 2 months old. My mother came here for a couple of reasons. One, just to build a better life for her and her then a young son, but also was fleeing the Marcos regime from the Philippines dictatorship. As you can imagine, it wasn't exactly an ideal life to be living, and came here along with a sister and her mother. And this is where she met my father. Interestingly enough, it was through her sister that she met my father. Her sister was going on a date with a gentleman in the Coast Guard, and that date brought my father as a distraction because my mother tagged along as a chaperone. As was the tradition in the Philippines, you never go on a date alone. And that didn't work out for my aunt, but it sure did for my mom and dad. They ended up meeting essentially by what was a blind date by accident. Ended up really hitting it off and married, and here I am. And they met in Washington, D.C., and got married and started their life here in the Washington, D.C. area. My mother, it's funny because they both grew up a world away. Mom grew up in the Philippines. My father grew up in rural Shenandoah Valley. It's amazing, though, despite that divide, how much they had in common. Speaking of humble beginnings, they came from much more even humble beginnings than I came from. Again, I mentioned my father had a high school education. My mother only got through sixth grade because in the Philippines, you actually had to pay for education through and through. She was one of 9, and the family could only afford to send the first 2 to school, and she was number 3. She was the first they couldn't afford to send past sixth grade. And in effect, she raised all the rest of her siblings while her 2 parents worked very hard to support the 9 children eventually that they had. Between the 2 of them, both my father and mother, again, very humble beginnings, their parents worked hard to make ends meet for all their children. Both of my parents had the same. And so you could tell where and why they got together, because they shared a lot of the same experiences and values, even again, though having grown up a world apart.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating story. And you're so right. I mean, culturally, your lives can be so different, but when you grow up in a similar environment or your values are the same, that's kind of all that matters sometimes. So thanks for sharing that. So tell us about your humble beginnings now, where you grew up in Prince Williams County. And I remember you mentioning a 900 square foot house. So tell us about what your area was like.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. In modern times, I every now and then troll around on Zillow and look at things. I said, well, let me go back to my old home. And it was really fascinating to look at that. And I saw that my house was listed as being 900 square feet. And, in today's world, that just is shocking, right? Of the homes that you tend to see. And I think, it's funny. I never thought of it as a humble beginning. I never thought that 900 square feet actually is a pretty small house. I guess it's all perspective, right? But yes, I grew up in Prince William County. For those that know the Washington, D.C. area, that's a suburb county outside of Washington, D.C. At the time, it was very, it was not what it is today as, modern urban sprawl has taken effect. It was very much, it was still considered suburbia, but definitely felt much more rural, had rural elements to it. In fact, when I went through school, the schools I went to covered, pretty much the whole geography of the county, such that people were bussed in from very far away that lived in mountainous areas of the county and in rural areas, which, again, just from the mix of the people that you interacted with, there were some that were living in the more suburbia part that I was in, and there were definitely, large populations of people that were coming from far and away out in more isolated areas. So it really was fascinating. I think actually that's what drew my parents to live there. Number one was affordability. They did, when they got married, they were in Washington, D.C. That was the first home we lived in, actually was an even smaller one-bedroom apartment in Washington, D.C. in a not-so-great part of town. And I remember my father telling me, when we got married, we didn't know how we were going to make it because suddenly we were going to pay $400 a month in mortgage, which is mind-boggling today by today's standards. And they said we moved into this house way out. That's all we could afford, and we didn't have any furniture. They described a time when, we were literally sleeping on the floor on mattresses for a long time because they couldn't afford the furniture. But they made it, right? They made it, and they made it work eventually. But yeah, that's the way Prince William County was. So yeah, Washington, D.C. is my home at that time. It felt a little far out. Now, if you know where Prince William County is in Manassas, it's actually right there in the midst of all of Washington, D.C. And so, yeah, and the house I lived in was 900 square feet. There were four of us living it. We shared one bathroom. Pretty amazing to think back now. Probably the three bedrooms that my brother, and my parents occupied, you could probably fit in my master bedroom today. It was open the door and the door hit the bed. And but again, the frame of reference was I didn't blink an eye at it, right? That just was the norm for me. And for my parents, it was their dream, that house. And flash forward to today. So again, perspective, I pause in thinking about humble beginnings because at the time it didn't feel like a humble beginning because frankly, my parents were happy and, very appreciative of what they had, which today I still appreciate that mindset of being thankful for what you got. But it wasn't until I got older in life to realize how humble that was, right, compared to today's standards. So yeah, it really is amazing just to reflect back on that. And I every now and then I'll drive by that neighborhood on the way. My father actually still lives in Virginia. He's still out way out in rural Virginia, and we'll every now and then drive by that neighborhood and fond memories for sure.
Oh, that's great. It is certainly all perspective, and you don't think about it really that way, but when you say 900 square feet, I think of like a small apartment in the city because that's what we think of now, nowadays. That's crazy. But yeah, you're right. When you're growing up in it and you seem to have what you need, you don't really think much about it.
That's right. Yeah.
So I understand you also grew up in the public school system. How was grade school for you academically, socially, recreationally? What kind of things were you into?
Yeah. Again, perspectives, right? Public school was all I knew. For me, my parents, that's all I knew. I didn't know there was a thing such as private school and magnet schools and things. That's just what you did. Again, reflecting back now and now being a mom of my own, definitely has given me different perspectives. At the time, again, I just, I thought nothing differently of it. Reflecting back, it was like, wow, the standards were very different than probably what I didn't know existed until later in life. But at the same time, if I reflect back to what my father and mother had access to, it actually was pretty phenomenal. So again, at the time felt it was it was definitely a robust educational experience. And then when I went on later in life to further education and realized the people that I was mixing with and their backgrounds and where they came from, I realized that, I came through a different standard perhaps. And I will say, I think that still exists today, and that's it tears at my heart a little bit. It also makes me very thankful. I live 2 counties away from where I grew up, and my daughter is going through this public school system, and I see and still have touch with where I grew up and see the standards just 2 counties away of how different it is. That my neighborhood is very low income, and a lot of those that are living probably near or at the poverty line, and 2 counties over, by standard issue, as an example, my daughter gets an iPad, whereas in my old school, it's 1 or 2 iPads or Kindles for a whole entire classroom. So again, I wasn't aware of this at the time. By the way, school was just what you did. I know that my parents worked to try to get me into school earlier. I was always on the younger spectrum because they had to work, and it saved them childcare to be able to get me into the school system a year earlier than probably most people would. It was a necessity from their income perspective. At the same time, I know that I was put through a standard that they didn't get the access to again, which I have to be thankful for. And I think I've had great success through my life as I've gone on academically. And, part of me thinks, okay, was that partially luck, right? Just because, again, of what I experienced and then saw later on in life. But no, it was, I went through my academics. I can't say that anything was outstanding or stellar to me in terms of memories. I did go through and graduate high school. I ended up as valedictorian, right? And I know that's a big accolade. I will say, I will fully admit, I wasn't the smartest person in my class. I know that, there were many that were much smarter than me. I just know that in the track that I was in, if you worked hard and you did your work, you could excel. I learned later in life, as I got mixed with others that had different academia experiences, sometimes working hard wasn't enough to excel. You actually had to be really smart. It just meant that I had to work harder, right, to catch up. I had the same finish line as everybody, but I had a different starting line, and I had to run a little harder and a little faster to catch up to everybody else. So, and again, today it's really apparent to me of what the difference is in the schools. And I have to give a nod to all teachers out there, especially for those that are under-resourced. A lot of them are. It's just some are more under-resourced than others, coupled with they're probably pulling kids along like that I was around, whose starting lines are much farther behind, and having to pull them alongside, trying to make sure that there's a gratifying academic experience even for those that are different. So I fully appreciate and give a nod to all teachers and educators out there, particularly those that are in public school systems, particularly those that are dealing with those types of demographics and trying to make sure that all their students succeed equally.
That's great point. And also I was thinking when you were talking about your parents working hard to get you in school earlier and, be able to give you the opportunities that you needed. Did working hard just kind of seem like a natural for you when you were in school? Like, this is just what I have to do. It's what I see. And
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great thought and observation. Absolutely. It was just a given. That's just what you did. Again, I didn't think anything of it. My mother worked multiple jobs. She was a seamstress, and then she would have a day job. I still have the visual of my mother in our unfinished basement with her sewing machine in the corner, sitting there after work sewing seat covers and curtains for her side gig that she did to make extra money. My dad probably worked every job imaginable, and some of these jobs today, I know a lot of people wouldn't even consider doing. Right? They're dangerous, they're laborious, tolling on the body, and they just did it. I distinctly remember at night and evening just looking at how tired my mother was, like physically tired. And today it's just that's something that most people don't see or appreciate. But she did it, and it was a norm. And then yes, as it pertained to school, first and foremost, my mother held high standards of me. I think she if you're familiar with Asian cultures, usually there's a lot of pressure to excel. Not to say that every culture, all cultures have that to some degree, and every parent pushes, but my mom pushed me hard. I think part of that was, hey, kid, you've got access to education. Make sure you're maximizing. Make sure you're taking it seriously. Don't take it for granted. So that undertone was always there. And so for me, it translated into, I've got to do well and show my mom that I'm going to do well and that I'm going to excel, that I'm going to get A's. And yeah, it was just the norm in my mindset. And again, yeah, absolutely influenced by my parents.
Yeah, I bet. That's interesting. Well, thanks for sharing. I know you mentioned earlier when we spoke that, you kind of had to navigate certain parts of academic life in high school, applying to colleges like that by yourself. So was that difficult at all, considering that you'd mentioned both your parents didn't have the educational opportunities that you had?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, it was another thing that I reflect back on with amazement. Neither of my parents went to college. In fact, nobody before me had really gone through what we know today is a standard 4-year college experience. My dad took some community college classes on the side, but never really pursued a college education. I do distinctly remember the time that I was getting to the point of considering college, and I still hear my dad's voice in my ear. It's got to be in-state and public because that's all we can afford. And that was about the guidance that I got. That was about it. And I also was in a school that didn't have the strongest of counseling, I would say. Again, no disrespect to the school system. I mean, they just, again, were under-resourced. And I'm going to date myself here, but I remember walking into the counselor's office where all the applications were and information that were available in the high school. And that was about it. It was me doing my own self-research. I remember looking at the walls and seeing the flyers of all the different schools. My first and foremost, I kid you not, I was taking my finger and looking through all the documents and saying, okay, which of these can I afford, right? My family, can they afford? And it did distill down naturally to the in-state and public, right? And in my head, I wasn't thinking scholarships or anything. I didn't know what that was, right? I didn't know how you go about that. I didn't know anything. All I knew is I had to have good grades. I was going to apply to these schools. Which ones could I afford? And it resonated pretty much, or it distilled it down pretty much to in-state public institutions. I did lie though. My dad gave me one other additional bit of suggestion or advice. He goes, that University of Virginia, they got a good basketball team. And that one also sticks in my head. It was half joking, but I laugh to this day because I'm a huge UVA basketball fan. I did awesome. End up going to UVA. And again, I'm going to date myself. At the time, it was $4,000 a year in tuition.
Wow.
And wow. It was, and I remember my father going, I don't know how we're going to afford that. Flash forward today, right? Perspective.
Wow.
But yeah, it was, I applied one place alone, sight unseen. I had never stepped foot in Charlottesville on the grounds of UVA. I did it based on, I hear that's a good school. I hear at the time I wanted to pursue medicine. I heard they've got a good, pre-med medical track. It's affordable. It's closer to home. And that was it. I applied early, sight unseen. I got in early admission and I applied nowhere else. And so essentially when I moved in, there was no pre-tour or anything. I walked in. It was the first time I had ever set grounds at UVA.
Wow.
Very different experience today, right? The whole notion of touring colleges that is typical. Even my husband, right? He talked about all these colleges he visited, and I didn't do any of that. I don't think my parents even had the wherewithal to even think that that's something you do. No guidance, and there was nobody that guided me through the application process or anything. Of course, today's standards, right? I don't know if my outcome would have been the same as it is today, but yeah, that maybe it was luck to some degree. But yeah, I landed in a school that I loved. I love it today, and I am so appreciative that I did land at a school that gave me the robust education, and frankly, it's just a really good. Yeah, it was a really good academic experience for me while I was there.
That's awesome. So why pre-med and how did that kind of play out?
Yeah. So I alluded back earlier, Amanda, to how Asian mothers tend to have a very strong influence on you. Culturally in the Philippines, I think the pinnacle profession that is often talked about is medicine. That is kind of one of the most noble things you can pursue. And so I would say there was probably some heavy influence from my mother in that, but I did love it. I started pursuing math and science in high school, and I did have a natural love for those classes. And so that felt to me almost like that was my destiny. So that's where my head was. And I went to UVA as a pre-med student, along with many, many, many others that, as I mentioned, had different academic experience before they got to UVA. So here's where things kind of took a turn. I went to UVA fully committed that I was going to be pre-med, fully committed that my chosen profession was that I was going to be a physician, a doctor at some point. And this is where I came to the realization that I was not good at it. I really wasn't. I may have been good at the high school level. When I got to the nitty gritty of it, I really struggled. I struggled just inherently within my own, but then much less. It was a very competitive environment, and a competitive environment against folks that had gone through deep technical schools like the Thomas Jeffersons of the world and so forth, or private schools in the Northeast, and that were just really at high academic standards. And I was in classes where you were graded along a bell curve, and so if you were not in the upper echelon, you fell below in your grades because you just didn't fall within that standard. But, aside from the grades, I fully realized that, wow, I really don't have the knack that I thought I did. It's very different when you advance this far. And I realized that my passion started to wane away really quickly away from it. Unfortunately, I came to this realization way far and deep in the academic career, such that I had mainly taken just about every pre-med course. But then it came to certain classes, namely organic chemistry, that I just could not get my head wrapped around. Could not get through that class, and that's a critical path class. It's one, if you don't get the concepts there, you're probably not going to get everything else from here on out, and that sealed my fate for my medical career. So but I will tell you, that was when I said I had a really good academic experience at UVA. He was like, wait a minute, you just said you kind of flunked out of chemistry. It was a good academic experience because for the first time in my life, I probably experienced failure. I experienced failure, but to realize that that's not the end of your story. And if there was anything I regret from my academic experience, is that I did not come to that conclusion earlier. I would have taken advantage of a lot more at UVA, because UVA is a phenomenal school. It's got a great diversity of offerings, and I regret that I didn't take full advantage of all those offerings while I was there because I had my head so set. So that has shaped me greatly as I've gone on in life, and now again as a mother. To encourage my child not to set their destinies too early in life, to enjoy the experiences that you're going to see, embrace failure, knowing that, hey, that actually might lead you down a different and better path. It will grow you as a person. It's great to be ambitious, but also be open to taking risks and sometimes failing, because you're going to learn a lot about yourself, and you're going to learn a lot about the world. You're also going to have a great appreciation for those people that are good at those things too. Right. And you're going to be good at your own things as well. So, I've gone even so far to coach my daughter, say, when people ask you what you want to be when you grow up, your answer is, I don't know. Yeah. Where are you going to go to school? I don't know. And by the way, that's probably going to spark their thoughts on things, and, you're going to learn a lot about other things. So, it shaped me a lot. That experience in college shaped me a lot. It certainly was a big slice of humility. For me, when I had come from, you can imagine that conversation with my mother when I was valedictorian, having a greater than 4.0 average, and then I was flunking out of a chemistry class. What the heck is going on? And that was, again, my first realization of the difference of my academic upbringing, if you will, compared to what others have. But then also it all taught me how to have the hard conversation, and to sometimes you have to burst other people's bubbles of expectations of you, right? Much less grappling with it with your own. So I grew a lot as a person from UVA through my failures.
I mean, if there's one thing I've learned from having so many of these conversations with executives like yourself, it's that the way that they've started their academic or career path to where it has, landed, they would have never imagined, and took turns and failures and things here and there. So it's, of course, when you're young and you experience a blow like that, it's like a shot to your self-esteem. But like you said, failure is a part of life, and learning from it really, really changes your perspective. So, and I have immigrant parents too, and I feel the stress of telling them that something didn't go right at school. Like when you said that, I was like, oh, those conversations are the worst. But
Absolutely. And, by the way, Amanda, I say all of that. My mother, God bless her, she passed away, 12 years ago. I felt the pressure from her. I absolutely felt the pressure from her. And it wasn't until later in life that I realized that she just wanted to make sure I was going to be okay. And that was a moment I remember, as much as I know I broke her heart that I wasn't going to be a doctor. The moment for me was later in life. It actually was at her mother's funeral, my Lola. And she turned to me while we're sitting there at the wake, and she looked at her mother, and then she looked at me. She said, and I think still to this day, she didn't understand what my profession was, but what she knew is that I could take care of myself. I had gotten a job. I was paying my bills. From her vantage point, I seemed successful. And that was my own peace moment. And it was her peace moment. She looked at me and she goes, one day this is going to be me. And I know you're going to be okay. Oh. I know that now. And so that, again, lesson in life is that failure isn't the end game. Even your parents or whomever may have felt some disappointment. You come to solace and peace with it at some point. At the end of the day, what matters is your family, and that you're going to be okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for sharing. That's beautiful. So tell us, okay, so pre-med didn't work out. You pivoted. What did you pivot to, and how did this kind of shape the rest of your college?
Yeah, it's really funny because you say pivot like it was that I had everything all figured out and like, okay, I'll just go over here and I'll be okay. I was derailed. I absolutely was derailed. So I graduated UVA again. I realized this way too late in life that this is what I didn't want to do. What I had not plotted is, well, what are you going to do? I graduated with essentially a degree that wouldn't really provide me a path, a clear, defined path. And I was faced with bills. I had bills to pay. I needed a car. I had to pay that. I actually got a condo. I had to pay that. And so I had to figure things out. I did live at home for a few months, right, just to get settled in and to get some money under my belt to do those things. But essentially, I didn't have a wayward path. So I took I wouldn't say the first job, right, but it was, I definitely went on search, and I just happened to go towards those professions that really you didn't need to have that prescriptive path. And as I would have it, I landed as a receptionist. Imagine that conversation with my mother, right? You just graduated from the University of Virginia and now you're going to be a receptionist. No, don't do your receptionist, by the way. I said, yeah, but it's a really good company. And so I ended up, I was a receptionist at a company that doesn't exist anymore, but probably resonates with the GovCon community, called EDS. Very large company. It was 120,000 employees global. I landed as a receptionist. I didn't know really what department it was. I just knew it was a big company, steady paycheck, big company, probably stable, can pay my bills. And it so happened to be the receptionist in the staffing department of EDS that ran all the recruiting for the company from the East Region headquarters. It was based out of Plano, Texas, but the Eastern Region headquarters was in Herndon, Virginia. So I landed in this receptionist role. And part of my job was not only to answer the phones, kind of for the general call-in. And remember, this is a day and age when recruiting happened by us putting ads in papers and people mailing in resumes or calling into a main line. That was me. That was me doing the intake of all of that. Also working with the executives that did recruiting. And so I took this job. I was in it, probably just weeks and maybe a couple months. And one of the staffing leaders, one of the team leads, and I will give her a nod, she is still in the industry today, She saw me. She was a supervisor, and she goes, you've got a really good personality. Have you ever thought about being a recruiter? And she saw also that I was looking at these resumes and putting two and two together and where they should go and to whom should be reviewing them. And she heard me on the phone with candidates, and she said, you've got the makings of a recruiter. And of course I said, well, what's that? What does that look like? I knew what a recruiter was, but what does that look like? I don't know what that is. Remember, this was a day and age where HR was not really taught in school. And it wasn't on my radar as a profession at all. I just knew, again, it was a paying job. And so she said, well, we got a great training program here at EDS. It was a big company. They actually had a very robust training program that taught, I reflect back to this day, just really good business skills. Not only did I learn about all the different types of jobs that people do and what their backgrounds are, but this program that they put me through taught me negotiation skills, taught me marketing skills, taught me how to talk to people that you don't, and that's a skill that is not natural to a lot of people. And they put me through that program, and it was a very rigorous program. I had to, even rehearse in front of the VP of the time at, my level at that time. And that was just, very nerve-wracking. But it was really robust. They wanted to make sure that I really could cut it as a recruiter. So I went through it. They graduated me. I started earning a paycheck as a recruiter. And that was my start in HR. Again, a profession I had never been on my radar. And as time went on, I ended up loving this profession and realizing it's a really phenomenal profession because it's got so many angles to it. And so then by that time, the HR profession started to show up in academia. So I eventually went on and got my master's degree while working. And again, being economically smart, I used tuition reimbursement to get the master's degree and went on to get my MBA. So here I am, right, all these years later. And it all was from let me just go explore this thing, right? Because somebody tapped me on the shoulder and said, hey, have you ever thought about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, seeing, what had happened in college, but then how your first job pretty much after college has kind of set you up for, this like position you're in today. It's kind of cool to see the connection. I mean, even from then, it's not that common to, that your first job after college kind of helps direct your pathway that clearly. So that's, I don't know, things happen for a reason,
Yeah. And that's funny you say that. I think one of the best comments I ever heard from somebody in my career said, aside from, learning a very technical skill in college, for the most part, a college degree means you're certifiably trainable to an employer, which I thought was a fantastic
so true
comment. There's a value to going to education. I know there's a lot of controversy about education and the value of college vis-a-vis now, the rise again of apprenticeship-like opportunities. And I think it all depends on what the profession is. But if anything, again, part of the value I got out of going to college were some of the softer things, like how to communicate, like how to write, like how to think through a problem, like how to connect the dots between things. And so, again, coaching my daughter, right, don't have to say that I'm going to be this when I grow up, but, appreciate every subject you're in to some level, because at the end of the day, this is going to help you in your long run understand and know what dots to connect, right? There's value even in going and saying, hey, maybe I don't ever intend to go down this path from a career perspective, but having some sort of knowledge just grows you as a person. Just be curious, right? Be curious. And so, these are all the lasting things. And, I learned at my first job, the power of a mentor. I didn't see it as a mentor at the time. Every now and then I'll touch base with her and say, you were my very first person I would ever say that was a mentor, because not only did she make me see something in myself that I didn't, she opened my eyes to something I wasn't aware of, and she supported me. She was my advocate along the way. And that is not something I would have done, particularly as my first job out of college, right? Never would I've had the confidence to even say, again, I was there to earn a paycheck, and that's all I cared about. And I probably would have just gone and ridden that path just to pay my bills without having that further ambition that was sparked by her just saying that one day. And I think as we all get deeper in our careers and climb up the ladder or climb the lattice or wherever you are, you don't give credit sometimes to those little small comments that you make to people that they really can impact a person. And so, for me, sometimes if I have a thought in my head, I have to also sometimes remember, pause for a minute and go tell that person right what you're seeing. Because, if you don't take that moment, you could probably miss the moment that maybe they didn't see and spark something in them. So yeah, it was a great learning experience of how, first of all, opportunities will show up in ways you never imagined, and the power of somebody just saying something, right? Whether she would have been a mentor to me or not, just her saying that one day was enough to kick me in my direction that I'm in today, and that's pretty powerful. Think about it.
Oh, absolutely. That's happened quite a bit though too in these interviews. It's kind of amazing the small difference that you don't realize someone's making in your life ends up being a big difference. But like you said, little comments, pushes in certain directions. So take us through, briefly the progression of your career, ultimately landing at V2X. How did your journey kind of progress after that?
Yeah. So again, as I mentioned, I started as a recruiter, and I would advocate for anybody interested in the HR profession. Recruiting is a phenomenal place to start. It's a way that you learn what people do, the diversity of jobs. You get to learn the business because you're talking to hiring managers and saying, okay, what is the value of this job and what are you going to do with it? So as we all know, in the industries we're in, it all goes back to the talent, right? The talent that you're going to get and that you need to do the jobs. So for me, it was the perfect starting point. I got to learn EDS. I got to learn GovCon. I got to learn the different types of work. I recruited just about everything from technical to non-technical. And it taught me, again, how to have just day-to-day conversations. Now, flash forward, I did end up leaving EDS. I went during the dot-com boom. I went to work for a company at the time called UUNet, if anybody remembers the days of the dot-com boom and the dawning of the internet. So I got to go really deep and technical in a dawning of high tech and the industry changing. So that to me got me experience in different market industries in the commercial side. But it also was my first lesson of how things can implode. EDS was a very structured, mature company. I went to what was for all intents and purposes, very much a startup feel, but ballooned and blossomed and grew very fast and became very wildly successful. If you remember those days that UUNet ran the internet backbone that AOL, which was big at the time, ran on. So this was the dawning of really, truly high tech in the modern era. And so, I learned a lot in that. That ending didn't happen. It also taught me that, things can come crashing down. There was a big dot-com bust, if you remember, too, that happened. So that, for me, actually was my first experience of being laid off when the bubble burst. That, too, was a very eye-opening and experience that taught me a lot of having to navigate that. Again, I was single at the time and paying bills, right? That was not a great time from an assurance perspective. But that did end up landing me back into GovCon. 2001, post 9/11, I was hired by SAIC as a recruiter. So here I am continuing my recruiting journey. And I started working at that time, recruiting in the intel space. So here was, again, another different industry. I did more federal civilian at EDS, but here's me going into more DoD and intel. So that was my first taste of working deeply in that area. Very different type of recruiting, very different type of jobs, as you can imagine. Learned a heck of a lot there as well. And again, another big, robust company. I stayed at SAIC Leidos for over 20 years, and that's really mind-boggling for me to think about because it was a company that went through so many evolutions and gave me such great experiences through just business in general, evolutions of relocating a headquarters and splitting a company, setting up shared services, these robust business experiences that really kind of made me feel like I was reinventing myself and my experience every few years. that was coupled with that naturally evolved a lot of the things I did and the roles I did, but also part of this too was me stepping out of my comfort zone. And I knew that's a pattern that you hear from a lot of people, that, when you feel like you're kind of bored, when you kind of feel like you're not flexing your brain muscle anymore, maybe it's time. And SAIC was so big and Leidos so big that it afforded me that, right? It was a big company. If I had stayed at EDS, I probably would have gotten the same thing too, right? But I moved out into different roles. I migrated from being a recruiter to a HR generalist, where you do everything from an employee life cycle to doing compensation. For me, compensation, that was probably one of my bigger bold moves, because compensation to me was one of those areas that I admitted was probably my weaker point. I needed to learn a lot, and it's a very technical part of HR. I think it gets underappreciated how much it contributes to the business. I give a nod to another mentor that took me under his wing, who was a very seasoned total rewards professional, and taught me a lot through that, and was very well knowing that one day I was probably going to want to rotate out. That was not what I wanted to be when I grew up completely. But while I was there, he gave me the robust experiences, taught me a lot, let me spread my wings to go and do things and learn the hard way, right? Really just throwing you in the water. And today I can tell you that has probably been some of the most valuable experience, was doing that type of thing, and particularly that area. So then I went on back into HR, now knowing probably too some of the most critical pieces, total rewards and recruiting, when you, particularly in the GovCon, but anywhere, that has just really allowed me to be successful and to navigate different parts of the business. So, again, after 21 years, now here I am at V2X, completely different, again, workforce. GovCon, different type of workforce. I will say this is absolutely the most diverse workforce I've ever worked with in my entirety of over 25 years in GovCon. It's very different. From an HR professional, it is so fulfilling, because it pretty much checks the box of every complexity you can possibly imagine. And I love the fact that V2X does this really well, the type of diversity of work that we do really well. It works in attracting and using and utilizing and providing opportunities for people with really diverse backgrounds and what they do. And, tying back to the humble beginnings, what drew me to V2X, it was, I came here and I realized, wow, I could almost go out to any hiring event, and it doesn't matter your pedigree. I'm used to being in the technical world. You have to have this degree and you have to have this many years of experience. And I come to V2X and I realized all the diversity of work we do here. I could almost walk into a military transition office, for example, and I don't, it doesn't matter what your background was or what you did in the military. I can probably hire you, right? Because we have so many opportunities, and you don't have to have that degree necessarily, right? And you don't have to have all those years of experience. And this was most evident, again, I got to meet all the leaders of V2X and knew that this is where I wanted to be, but it was really telling to me. I think the moment that I realized I had landed in a really good place culturally is about a month into my tenure at V2X. And I took a big trip over to the Middle East. And the Middle East is actually one of our biggest presence in our locations. First and foremost, just get an awe and appreciation of seeing our employees side by side with the military members on ground in the desert heat in July of 131 degrees, and they're out there, right? They're out there with them. And it was during a tour of one of the bases that we are there supporting our military members on. And our CEO was ahead of us, and he's walking around touring, and I was a little bit back behind, and I was walking side by side with one of our key leaders over there. He's well respected, one of our most senior leaders, and he turned to me and he goes, "Ma'am, he's like, I'm so proud to be a V2X employee. I love what I do." And he said, not bad for a guy who's got a GED. And so as he's talking to me, the first thought I had was like, this guy's just like my dad, right? This is a guy who's just like my dad, that just had a high school degree. And he said, I'm well advanced in, he's well advanced in his career, older in age probably than the typical person you would hear say this, but he said, I'm going back and getting my bachelor's degree.
Wow. And
I smiled at him and I said, good for you. Good for you. he said, I never thought in a million years I'd ever have a job like this, that I would be in a management position like this, that I would have this type of opportunity. Because, when you have a GED, I think people kind of write you off, that you're not going to have that opportunity in your lifetime. And he said, here I am. And I said, good for you, right? Deep in your career, that you're saying, hey, this is a passion, that you found passion in your career, and that you found a passion in yourself, right? To go and further yourself. And that was just one of many stories, right? And talking to some of the other employees that we have, those that are working overseas, and also thank you for the opportunity. Some of them are from other countries, and they're sending money back home so that they can help support their families, so they can also have opportunities to further themselves, much less they themselves. The more and more I met employees, I felt like I came home. I came home to, a workforce that, wow, they had a different starting line. They had a different starting line, but they too are striving for the same finish line that we all are. And here's a company that allows them to do that. And the CEO asked me at the time, as we were departing away from our trip to the Middle East and meeting all of our employees, and he said, well, what did you think? And I said, I just fell in love. I fell in love with this workforce. I'm all in. Absolutely. I fell in love with the workforce here at V2X. And so I have a great passion for, I'm here, that we'll continue to tell that story as V2X, that will build our brand. We will, continue to build our capability around giving people opportunity to not only join us, but to be the best, to contribute in the best way that they can, not only to further their career, but they're doing good work for us, right? And you can see in them what I see in, my family and those from the generations before me, a commitment and a loyalty and a hardworking ethos, right? That really resonates with me. So, great nod to all the 16,000 employees at V2X. First and foremost, the humble beginnings that many of them came from, but the mission that they're doing. Again, so, also, take into account the employees that are in the Middle East, and we know what's going on over there. A lot of the employees at V2X are sometimes working in not so safe places. And they're not wavering, right? This is just, they know that this is their appetito, this is their commitment. They continue to work hard. It's just an amazing workforce, right? So, I'm feeling very fulfilled. I'm very committed to making sure that, we support that workforce that is doing that. And also those, not only current employees, those employees that will be V2X one day. So it's a great fit for me personally. And by the way, that's the way the whole executive leadership team here is at V2X. That too is feeling good about the alignment of the entirety of the executive team. Same mindset, all committed to the people, to the workforce, to what we do every day. That's what drew me really to V2X.
I mean, it's so clear to hear the passion in your voice when you're talking about it. And from my perspective, knowing your story now and your background, it feels like you were the right person. You were there at the right time, right place when you were speaking to that employee in the Middle East. I mean, you can connect on so many, personable levels, but that's a really, really cool story. And I kind of feel that passion. So thanks for sharing. Before we close, I want to make sure we also talk about the ways in which you support and help underprivileged students. So tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, it's always, I'm a firm believer in the pay it forward mentality. And I wouldn't say always is it something that I'm intentionally doing. I just realize that I do it every now and then, right? Every day, even just to even my own family, and that they don't see the potential in themselves. And by the way, that's a cultural thing too. I mentioned the Filipino culture is that your parents tend to push you, but you also tend to not think of yourself first. It's always somebody else. And so through that, sometimes you don't realize your own potential. And so sometimes I feel like I'm having those conversations even with my own family, my cousins. And by the way, I have 31 cousins of the large Filipino family. And by the way, also because of that, right, I've got a lot of others, the kids of the next generation. That to me is where I really smile, to see the next generation doing the great things that they're doing. Beyond us. But, when I come across those entities or kids that are the first generation, whether they're first generation American or first generation going to college. I get it, right? I get what they're going through. I probably realize more than they do, to some degree, that what they're not getting. And I've had instances where I have met kids, and to guide them, I've been involved in organizations that help guide those high school kids just even understand the whole process around college, because their parents don't know, just like I did. Boy, I really could have used that, right? I know in my life, I really could have used that. If somebody just told me that there are things such as scholarships, maybe I wouldn't have had all those bills to pay. If I knew that I could have applied to more schools, not to say I wasn't happy at UVA, that worked out, but I probably could have opened the aperture more. I could have gone and done college tours. I could have pursued other things, right? I just didn't see it. And so for those that are rising up, that don't have that infrastructure, they're already behind. And, I've seen instances where, when they're guided to, they start to realize it, and you can see them, they're running that race, right? They're starting, I know it's different, but they're running faster and they're catching up. And I love seeing that. I love seeing that result. Whether again, it's helping somebody with their college application or even further in their career to say, hey, have you ever thought about this? It brings back memories, right, of what I myself personally experienced. And it's just so gratifying, right? It's so gratifying to play that part and to give back those same elements that I got, that I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for all of that, right? I absolutely wouldn't be here. Who knows where I would have been had it not been for somebody helping me along the way. So yeah, it's a great passion. And for anybody that is in the seat that has that ability to help people along, it's absolutely gratifying.
Awesome. Well, Joanne, I want to close with, I usually ask this question. Obviously, your career, your journey isn't over, but what do you still hope to accomplish, or what's next for you? Anything that you're, hoping for?
Yeah, no, for me, I think, again, I'm here at V2X. While I'm here at V2X, I want to do all those things I said. I want to build that brand. I want to accelerate being the employer that helps people build their careers. For me personally, to continue to use this platform, right? I am in a place now that I have a voice, and I didn't have, that always in my career, to be able to lend that voice and to be an influencer of helping others. At the end of the day, though, is to be a good mom, right? To be a good mom too, to hopefully, if anything, if I am successful in making sure that my daughter lives her life with eyes wide open and appreciation for the diversity of backgrounds that people come from and what they do, to me, above and beyond anything I do from a career perspective, that to me will be success in my life. So I hope I will have that moment like my mother did when I was with her and my grandmother, that I will be able to tell my kid, I know you're going to be okay. That's, I think, every parent, what we all aspire to.
Awesome. Well, Joanne, thank you so much for sharing a story with us. I've really enjoyed talking to you, and thank you for opening up. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Do you know an executive in GovCon with a humble beginning? We'd love to share their story. Shoot us an email telling us a bit about them, and maybe one day you'll hear them on Humble Beginnings. You can reach us at media@WashingtonExec.com.